In 1994, a village mullah in the western Kandahar district of Maiwand, along with 30 students armed with 16 rifles, intervened on behalf of two younger girls who had been kidnapped and raped by a local warlord. 2 years later, in September 1996, that mullah, now with an army of thousands of students, descended upon the capital of Kabul, effectively ending the regime of the Mujahideen. Calling themselves the Taliban, Arabic for students, these Pashtun extremists would institute sweeping Islamic reforms in the name of Sharia law and bring about the longest period of relative peace in the country for decades before or after. How did a group of teenagers led by the Islamic equivalent of a local parish priest gain so much power so quickly? Today, we will discuss the origin and rise of the Taliban and their enigmatic leader, Mullah Mohammed Omar. Welcome to the Boardwalk.
Welcome back to the Boardwalk, episode 5. For those of you that have been listening, thank you very much. If you want to see more of our content, we have an Instagram page with links to our various streaming sources on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts, as well as a link for Buzzsprout if you want to listen on your desktop. We've got about double the views here in the last week, so thanks for telling other people about the podcast and getting it out there. We're really happy about that. Like we said last week, we're not trying to make any money, but we do feel like this is a pretty important series of events over the last 20 years, and we need to be aware of this stuff. This week's episode, I think we're probably the one that we're most excited to talk about so far, is the origin story of the Taliban and their first leader, or Emir, Mullah Muhammad Omar. I'm pretty excited for this week.
Yeah, absolutely. No, this is a really, really fascinating topic to cover, especially like with what little we know of like Mullah Omar's past and origins. He doing a lot of research for this podcast. He almost has a like Robin Hood type vibe to him. Just very enigmatic leader. There's only what like two pictures of the guy that people have
Yeah,
been
there's
able to get.
basically just like one or two photos of Omar.
Yeah,
Well, there's that third one they released after he died when he was like 18 and had a really good looking beard already
yeah, and two eyes.
and two eyes. You're right.
So,
So, yeah, Mullah Omar had one eye by the time he became the founder and leader of the Taliban. So, I guess the story for the origins of the Taliban, like Stu said in the intro, it kind of starts in 1994, but it really starts before that when the Soviets left Afghanistan. When that happened, like we talked about in some of the previous episodes with these regional warlords, you had Ismail Khan, who he ran his little militia or his mujahideen out in western Afghanistan. Up north, you had Abdul Rashid Dostum and Ahmad Shah Massoud with the Northern Alliance, and then Dostum's Uzbek fighters. You had Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in eastern Afghanistan, and then in the central part of this country, you had Karim Khalili, who was the Hazara Mujahideen leader. What you didn't have was any sort of consolidated fighting force in southern Afghanistan in that historic Pashtun region. And that's what would ultimately lead up or allow for Mullah Omar to become that leader in the South.
Yeah, I think the South is a classic example of kind of an endless string of power vacuums in Afghanistan, and those power vacuums there especially they need to be filled. We saw that last week with Razik, and we'll see it this week with the Taliban.
yeah, and Kandahar was the most natural place for a cleric and mullah and religious order to break out and start taking control because it is the religious center of Afghanistan, um, and also a very important historical center of Afghanistan. King Durrani, who founded Afghanistan about 250 or so years ago, lies in Kandahar city, and alongside him lies the shrine of the Prophet's Cloak, which King Durrani apparently brought back from some big conquest that he was involved with. But it's believed that Muhammad's cloak is there, and it heals people, and blind people go and see it, and they're healed, and it
Well,
has a
I
very
don't think
important.
blind people see it originally.
Yeah, but it's historically very important for Muslims in Afghanistan, and also, as we'll see, for Mullah Omar's origins.
So I think in order to get to that Taliban creation, I think the best natural starting point is just Mullah Omar's backstory and what got him to that point in Maywand in 1994. Mullah Omar, born in Kandahar province in southern Afghanistan, moved to Darawud in Uruzgan when he was younger after his father died. But Uruzgan shares a lot of those conservative traditionalist traits that Kandahar shares. Still considered himself a Kandahari at the end of the day. Uh, his family, like many during the startup of the Soviet invasion, the communist uprising, they fled to Pakistan and sought refuge. And when he was there, he went to a madrasa, the Darul Uloom Haqqaniya. And Darul Uloom is the term for basically another way of saying it's a madrasa. It's a school for Islamic teachings, and it was in, I believe it was in Pakistan, in a part of Pakistan. Pakistan, all of Pakistan used to be India, but uh, the madrasa was uh, you had various schools of teaching or schools of thought, just like when you go to America, you have charter schools, public schools, private schools. There's schools all have some common similarity, but there's different aspects and elements to them. And the madrasa where Omar was educated practiced or preached Deobandism, which it is this anti-colonial view of Islam that arose during the British Indian Empire.
Yeah, and it's very similar to Wahhabism, which is what the Islamic State follows. Essentially, it's a break off of the Sunni traditions, kind of like how Catholicism and Christianity are similar, but have very different religious beliefs and structures at their core. So, Deobandism, a big thing with it is trying to root out perceived Western influences in an area, and also not being very country focused, more being faith focused. So we'd see a lot of similar belief structures following a lot of the Islamic fundamentalists that the United States and its allies fought during the last 20 years in both Afghanistan and Iraq. The willingness to move from one country to another in order to defend the faith is like a core pillar, Deobandism extremism.
And you definitely, I mean, you not only see that with Mullah Omar, but kind of that whole, I don't know, more Arab inspired. I hate to say Arab inspired Islam because Afghanistan before this influence of, you know, Arabic Islam had their own kind of version. We've talked about Pashtunwali and all that before, and now here it comes, and here comes things like suicide bombers and stuff that Afghanistan hadn't seen before, and that's you kind of bring that with it.
And it's something that even Mullah Omar initially was opposed to, right? Because that's not how they view the righteous or appropriate way to fight this war.
Oh yeah, and especially, I mean, gosh, the Soviet invasion was so influential on the region for years after, because in my research I saw a lot of Arabs ended up coming to Afghanistan to help sort of fight off the invaders. Now, according to what I read, a lot of them were kind of sitting on the sidelines, including Bin Laden, who apparently a lot of Arabs kind of sat on the sides and provided more of a support role than actual fighting, because Afghans viewed it as an Afghan fight. But all those guys came over, and they were very heavily influenced by this Deobandist form of Islam and protecting the faith against invaders.
Yeah, I mean, Bin Laden's biggest contribution to radical Islam in the 30 years that he was involved, not even 25 years, was he had deep pockets,
Oh
right?
yeah.
When he came over, he came from a wealthy family. His father was an engineer in Saudi Arabia. That's where he became a key player in all of this. Is he had the money that they needed, and which in turn bought him those connections in Saudi Arabia, in the Gulf states, and in Pakistan. Even though Pakistan will always say that they are not funding or supporting the Taliban, but our viewer in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, may beg to differ.
Yeah, that's always interesting seeing a listener from Pakistan show up on our very small podcast. But but this whole, I mean, Wahhabism or even Mullah Omar's uh, ideology as well. You kind of see that in Afghanistan now. Is this push by other Arab states, particularly like Saudi Arabia, to fund these madrasas we talked about earlier in the episode. So they fund these madrasas, and then um, they teach their school of Islamic thought in these schools. And so, you know, all these young people are being indoctrinated essentially into thinking like whichever Gulf state or Arab state is sponsoring their madrasa.
Yeah, and Pakistan was pretty heavily involved in funding a lot of the madrasas, especially along the border with Afghanistan as well, and that influenced thousands and thousands of young people who were displaced by the Soviet conflict. Because when the Soviets came in, there were something like a million or 2 million displaced people during that conflict, and those kids had to, go somewhere and do something, and a lot of them ended up in these madrasas learning about this very specific sect of Islam and the specific ideals that they took back with them, and ultimately influenced the founding of a lot of insurgent groups in Afghanistan, very specifically the Taliban.
So Stu, I think you're saying, they had a bunch of displaced young men in Pakistan being taught by people who followed a certain type of Islam, like Mullah Omar, and maybe they got to see what was going on in their country while they were away, and that kind of you know fermented, so to speak.
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. And man, the Soviet invasion, I mean, it was very difficult for a lot of these families. I think post Soviet invasion, there were something like 98,000 households in Afghanistan that were headed by widows because their husbands had died. I mean, it was very, very instrumental in forming the like a informing like a mindset for these young men and teens and children, and turning them against a lot of foreign intervention or uh, invasion of the country.
Yeah, it was a really good strategic decision by and this is during the Soviet time between Pakistan and the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, right there. We were working with both those countries during the Soviet-Afghan war, trying to counter uh, the Soviet invasion, and it was a great tactic, right? You had millions, literally millions of refugees in Pakistan, some in Iran as well, that you could use. Uh, we weren't going to train them, but we were going to arm them and supply them, which is what we ultimately ended up doing. Uh, to the tune of but we only spent like 10% of what the Soviets spent, right? Because it was all indirect spending. It was matched by Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Pakistan and all those countries. But the thing that carried over after the Soviets left was that there were all of these Afghan refugees in these Pakistani ran madrasas being taught this Deobandi version of Islam mixed in with Wahhabism and to an extent Pashtun nationalism that would create just a treasure trove of recruits for the eventual civil war that came to follow. And that's where Omar really got his rise, right? He left Afghanistan as a teenager, went into Pakistan. He came back after the Soviets invaded, and he was maybe I think he was born in 1960. They think so. He would have been about 19, 20 years old when the Soviets invaded. And his story doesn't start with the Soviet war, right? Because he was a low level mujahideen fighter, never really rose through the ranks or anything like that. It's after the Soviets leave, he goes back home to Kandahar and he becomes a mullah, which, yeah, like Stu said in the intro, a mullah is no different than a local priest or a bishop. They're not necessarily a high ranking member in the church, So he was a local religious scholar, priest type figure, and his rise came, like we were talking about. He was out in Maywan in western Kandahar. He had 30 students at his madrasa, which I'm not sure if that's a lot for Maywan in 1994, but it seems like a lot. The fact that they had 16 rifles is interesting, but he's sitting here with his students and he's teaching them his version of this Deobandi Wahhabist Sunni Islam. And the villagers come to him. We have two girls who've been kidnapped and raped by a warlord. And for a lot of the stuff that we were talking about in the culture episode about um, how different it is in southern Afghanistan, the Taliban have always not tolerated things like rape and molestation and pedophilia. So Mullah Omar showed up with his band of students, and they hung that warlord by the barrel of a tank. Which, leading up to Kabul, they hung a lot of people by the barrel of tanks. That was like their go-to way of getting rid of people.
Certainly made a spectacle of things. Yeah.
Oh yeah, it for sure send a message, right? This is the penalty for this infraction or that infraction. And so you get to this point. This is like early 1994. He intervenes on behalf of these two girls from a village, and then after that, word spread throughout the province, first throughout Maywan district, about this local mullah who came on behalf of these girls and helped them, and took care of this problem of this warlord. And more people would come and reach out to him for aid and assistance, because like we were talking about with the Afghan police and the Afghan army being somewhat corrupt, like that's not a new thing that came with America. They were corrupt before we got there.
Yeah, and I mean there's a ton of stories too of like Taliban intervening for people. I think Rashid also had a story talking about a squad of Taliban freeing a young boy over whom two warlords were fighting for the right to sodomize, essentially. And like same thing, to the Taliban's credit, they are not big on allowing rape by warlords, although there's plenty of plenty of atrocities that they ended up being involved with later on as the war progressed. But yeah, this like huge rise of the Taliban came in a country that had just experienced about a decade of war with a world power, and then just the complete chaos as that seat of power left, and all of the people that had been fighting them suddenly started fighting each other over land or resources or whatever they could get.
And what happened when Omar started to when he started to move his body of 30 students around, and intervene and help out local villagers and things like that, he started to gain more following, right? That 30 students became 100 students who wanted to learn under him, and 200, and eventually Pakistan, more specifically the Pakistani Inter-Services Intelligence, which is you're going to hear us refer to it as the ISI. It's their version of the CIA. They started to get wind of this, right? And Pakistan wanted a player in the South that they felt they could back and who would work in their best interests. And chief among those interests was trade and an anti-Iranian slant. And so really Omar starts to get his push. He gets a couple hundred students under his wing. Pakistan notices, and the ISI starts funding him. They start working with those madrasas in within the refugee camps, and then in northern Pakistan and the federally administrated tribal areas. And before you know it, by the end of 1994, Mullah Omar had taken Kandahar city, and he had an army of thousands of students.
Yeah, I think the estimate was about 12,000 recruits joined the Taliban by the end of 1994. So you go from this, small force to, this surging movement that's ready to branch out, gain more followers as they push to other areas, and eventually conquer the entire country. So at this point, Mullah Omar has grown his flock into an army essentially, and he starts pushing west. And um, by, let's see, November 3rd, after taking Kandahar, they start pushing northwest. So by February 1995, they'd controlled about 9 of Afghanistan's provinces, all in the southwest. Pushing forward on September 5th, 1995, they seized Herat and sent Ismail Khan, who was the warlord in that area, into exile in Iran. Following that, they started pushing sort of like northeast from Kandahar up through the greater Paktia area, which was controlled by the Haqqani family. Jaludan Haqqani is a very important figure in Afghanistan. At this point, he controls a huge area of provinces. You have Paktia, Paktika, Khost, Ghazni, and Wardak, which have been pretty rough areas for U.S. occupation in the area. And essentially, he's sort of absorbed into like a united front with the Taliban. He decides to accept Mullah Omar as like the leader of the movement, and they push on and take Jalalabad by early 1996.
And picking up Haqqani is one of the best things strategically that the Taliban did.
Yeah.
The Haqqani network there in eastern Afghanistan was so very aligned with the Taliban ideology compared to the rest of the warlords in the country that I guess they were more than happy to accept that they're going to get beaten by this superior force of Talib. So they essentially sign up, and they always had like a pretty much an alliance from that point on. But the other warlords of the country, I mean, they're not nearly organized or connected, and they all hate each other. So, I mean, basically it's a divide and conquer strategy, except the Taliban didn't even have to divide them. They already hated each other. So they just go and, like moving around a chessboard with the queen.
The Taliban, they took a lot of area, they took a lot of ground, and we'll probably circle back to this towards the end of the episode. They're taking over a lot of ground again here in 2021 without firing a single round, right? And they're taking advantage of that internal strife, like here in the 90s between the various factions, and today just with they're taking advantage of the general dysfunction within the country. But there are a lot of similarities there. They were able to push through these provinces relatively unimposed or unimpeded, to the point that they had the South and the West, and then they were moving up to the East and grabbing the Haqqani family and their fighters.
And the Haqqani would become. I mean, I think they're. If they aren't, they at least were for a long time the biggest terrorist organization in Afghanistan, responsible for a lot of facilitation of suicide attacks into Kabul and against coalition forces in that like greater Paktia area, as it's called. So they were, you're getting a group of people that are very heavily indoctrinated into Deobandism and are pretty good fighters. Like from what I've like seen and heard, the Haqqani are like a step above your average Taliban fighter. They get better training, and there's also some coordination with Pakistani ISI supposedly. So pretty definitely a good get for Omar. And so essentially at this point, it's spring of 1996, and the Taliban basically own a big like Nike symbol of Afghanistan. Kabul still hasn't fallen, and the warlords of the Northern Alliance, which hasn't formed yet, it's just a bunch of angry mujahideen mainly consist of what, Dostum, Masood, and Hekmatyar. Am I missing anybody?
I mean, not really, not in the Kabul area. I mean, obviously
Yeah,
there's going to be
but
tons
the,
of
the
people.
the big players.
Yeah, that sounds about right. And then the president, who was what, Rabbani, I think, or no, Najibullah was the president. Yeah, you had those guys.
Had
Not
the
a lot
president been
remaining.
ousted yet?
He was in early '96. I don't think so. I think Najibullah was still the president, so he naturally would align.
Sure, he
with
was
the Northern
enjoying
Alliance.
getting shelled by Hekmatyar daily, and then later doused him when he jumped over. Those guys are a trip.
No, Najibullah was out
Okay,
in '92.
Okay.
I mean, the country was essentially ungoverned. Sorry, I've got to bring my green and white stuff in.
No, that's fine.
To this conversation.
I know Najibullah, he comes back in like 96, 97, once the Taliban take over. They did kill him. I know that.
Yeah, they hanged him from a light post.
Yeah. Because that's what they do, is they hang people.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically...
At least in the 90s they did. They didn't hang anybody when we were there.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I guess not.
They must have matured.
Well, they probably did. We just don't.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of. I'm sure they hanged somebody. But all right, so we're at this key point in history. The Taliban is on the verge of sweeping north and basically wiping out any other resistance to them. And at this point, we come to probably the biggest sort of Robin Hood tale of Mullah Omar's rise, and that's involves Muhammad's cloak. So, as I said earlier, King Durrani's body and the shrine of the Prophet's cloak are in the center of Kandahar city. And one day, Mullah Omar moved over there and said, "Hey, I want to view the cloak." So he goes in, and according to the keeper of the cloak, I found an article interviewing him. He was so overwhelmed by the sacred ancient robe that he trembled, and he tried to turn towards Mecca, but he actually turned to the south, and the keeper had to sort of maneuver him towards Mecca so he could praise Allah. And then he asked the keeper if he could take the cloak and sort of present it to the people, and the keeper agreed, bearing in mind that the guy was in charge of an army of students. That was probably a good idea to go along with it. So he goes onto a hilltop and he displays the cloak for a ton of mullahs and religious scholars in the area, and they proclaim him Amir ul Momin, which is an Islamic title that means commander of the faithful. And it's at this point that Mullah Omar basically fully adopts like the eventual position that he'd take once they took the country of like the Amir of the Islamic state of Afghanistan. It was at this point that he turned his gaze onto Kabul and prepared to take the city.
And a big reason he was able to do this, like you talked about, he had those mullahs and those scholars. So he had, I think they're called ulama, which is like the next level up. It's a more refined, a more educated Islamic scholar, right? But the big reason why he's able to do this, Kandahar is the second largest city in Afghanistan, but it's very conservative. It was a big deal for Omar to pull out that cloak and to don it and to stand there. And so you had all these old school Pashtun Islamic leaders or Islamic scholars. They saw that, and it's really amazing. We were talking in the break before we hit record again. Like I'm sitting there thinking, God, all I have to do is put on the cloak, and I can run an army of thousands of people. But it was that in the big picture, it was that easy to do, to get that legitimacy, and with that legitimacy came that support from Pakistan and that buy-in from people like Jaludan Haqqani.
Yeah, it was really his King Arthur moment, presenting the sword of
Excalibur. Yeah, you're thinking Excalibur.
Yeah.
and the king arc.
Well, I was yeah, the sword of the Britons, essentially, or whatever the basis is, and gaining the full like support of everybody, which they had plenty of already. I mean, they had a pretty easy way going once they kicked the local warlord out. Young people would flock to them.
Mm-hmm.
Mullah Cable was talking about how he heard that this Taliban group was coming, and he thought, well, that sounds a lot better than all the crazy stuff that's going on here, so might as well join that. And that's across the country with thousands of young people that didn't have anything to do other than be ruled by these horrific madmen.
I mean, and you see that throughout history too. An offer of stability is tempting when the alternative is kind of endless war.
And we're kind of seeing that play out now, and we'll touch on that for sure. But it also helps when you're 6'6".
Yeah, tall. Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Mullah Omar was a foot taller than everybody else in southern Afghanistan, so he carried some sway. Right, he was that. We talk about him. We say like a mythical figure, partly because there were 2 or 3 known pictures of him, but there's also that he was 6 feet 6 inches tall. The average Afghan, I believe, is like 5'7". Most Afghans can't read or write in Dari or Pashto, and he could speak Arabic and read Arabic and write Arabic. So there was a lot about him that was very appealing to these Afghans who'd only known war their entire life. And it paid off when they ultimately make it to Kabul in September of '96. Right, they solidify their control of the West out in Herat. They push Ismail Khan out. I think he goes to Iran at first, and then I think maybe Turkey. They push up to Mazar-e Sharif, and then they ultimately descend upon Kabul, and they take Kabul in September of 1996.
That's pretty much all she wrote. I mean, they gain they pretty much secure the entire country pretty easily once all the warlords are kind of divided up and forced into exile.
Yeah, basically what Badakhshan was like the one province that they didn't take because Massoud collapsed his entire force there, and then he was basically fighting a guerrilla war for 3 years until the U.S. invasion and his eventual death.
Yeah, and really what that introduced was, I would say, the Taliban's hardest task to date, which was now they had to govern. Right? It's one thing to fight a battle of conquest, but now you have a country and you've got to preside and rule over it. And that's where you see the Taliban kind of really start to unravel.
It's kind of how I pictured like Donald Trump after he won the election and realized he actually won it. I imagine that's what the Taliban were like. They're
like Mr. Garrison on that in South Park.
It's we took the country and now we're how do you run a country? I don't know. And and like you said, it kind of falls apart on them. So the Taliban come into power. They decide they have to run the country because it needs to be run, and the people that they're governing have lived in a state of perpetual war, especially outside of the major cities and even in the major cities during the civil war. So the Taliban are got to figure out how to run the country. Well, obviously, being very strict fundamentalists, they established these Sharia, Taliban governed courts in all the districts to settle disputes. And the Taliban were known for being exceptionally brutal. There's stories of them, executing people in soccer stadiums. The Taliban ban. It's always weird to say the Taliban banned something, but the Taliban banned anything fun. So no sports, no music, nothing that makes life sort of enjoyable.
No kite flying.
It's what?
No kite flying.
No kite. Yeah, they Talibanned it. Yeah, that's right. They Talibanned kite flying. They Talibanned everything, man. And so, so it's just an absolutely brutal regime to live under. So you go from living under constant war to like now this totalitarian Islamic state. So I don't know. What do you guys think?
Well, so like with that, there's the wide sweeping Sharia the Sharia themed bans and practices they put into place. But with that, what really like drives that home is that you had all these southern Durrani Pashtun Taliban commanders who were named governors for all these provinces up north that were all Uzbeks and Tajiks and Hazaras who all spoke Dari, and the Taliban didn't. And so that created a whole other set of problems.
Yeah, I mean, like we covered in the cultural episode, the region you come from in Afghanistan, your ethnicity and culture is, very important to people. So you have all these guys with black turbans that speak a similar but different language to you suddenly being in control of this area. And it's like when the Mujahideen were ruling, except there's no rival commander that you could turn to if one group was being more too brutal to you. And so you're suddenly dealing with essentially like the northerners were essentially living with invaders from the south that were very different from them, imposing these strict rules.
Yeah, and the Taliban government, excuse me, that existed from September 1996 to September 2001, roughly. There's so much to unpack there, right? You had one we've discussed it, where Pakistan was supporting this movement because it was basically their representation within Afghanistan, very similar to Saudi Arabia and Iran funding various insurgent and extremist groups in Iraq, trying to curry favor and more influence. You have that. Then you have the reality of this is now the government. Mullah Omar was the head of the government of Afghanistan. They called it the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. He operated down in Kandahar. He only went to Kabul twice before he fled for Pakistan in 2001. What he did instead is he created a shura up in Kabul. They called it the Kabul Shura. It was a group of like not self-appointed, but officials appointed by Omar to run the country from Kabul, while he really ran the country from Kandahar. And I'm not going to say that you see Mullah Omar become neurotic, but you do see him taking steps to make sure that he can't be overtaken from within in the form of a coup or anything like that. He would take individuals, he'd name them provincial governors. They'd run a province, they'd run it poorly because they don't understand the local customs and traditions and the language and the people in general. He'd have them run the province for a year or so. Then he'd move them back to the front lines and they'd be fighting against the Northern Alliance, right? That's the internal issues from the standpoint of Mullah Omar when it came to governing. There's obviously, like we were discussing, the lack of cultural understanding. And then you have to factor there were 30 something non-governmental organizations in Afghanistan providing aid in various forms to displaced citizens and women and children and widows of the Mujahideen. And now the Taliban have to work with these Western agencies that they espouse contempt for. And it ultimately led to the Taliban kicking out all of the NGOs from Afghanistan. And all the while, rereading Taliban by Ahmed Rashid, and the Clinton administration had to make a choice, right? And from what I've read and seen, the official answer was there was no answer, but ultimately the Taliban was anti-Iran. And so America really didn't have a big plan to intervene and stop them from running the country. Instead, what you saw was several instances where the UN or sometimes NATO would point out these atrocity, and I think atrocity is probably the correct word when you have public hangings and executions and punishments where you cut off limbs for stealing. They called this stuff out, and the Taliban's response was they would go back to their religious police, very similar to what Saudi Arabia has, people that just go around and make sure that the locals are following their interpretation of Sharia Islam. They would tell the religious police to start cracking down more. And what you saw was more punishments. There's a great story. Well, I don't mean great in a good positive way, but there's a story of UN representative, and the name escapes me right now. He came to visit Kabul and speak to the Taliban government, and the Taliban, in their best interest, they decided to hold off public execution day, which is Fridays, until after he left. That's how the government, that's how the country was ran. So not only did you have outsiders from the South now running the North, but you had this this foreign version of Islam, which and most Muslims would tell you that this is not Islamic at all. This radical interpretation that they call Sharia, this radical version of Islam being instituted and implemented throughout the entire country, which made them wildly unpopular.
Especially after their promises of bringing peace and stability, which they technically did, but you're living under this brutal government that's just cracking down on everybody. Like, men had to grow fist length beards, women had to wear burqas and not leave home unless absolutely necessary. And that's areas where people weren't actively fighting the Taliban. Like in 1997, the Taliban seizing Mazar-e Sharif up in the north for the first time. They got kicked out after about less than a day by a rebellion backed by Massoud and his fighters. And then when the Taliban took the city a year later, they ended up just massacring thousands of people.
Mm-hmm.
So it's even if you're in an area that's somewhat away from Taliban influence, if they get there and you don't surrender to them, it's going to be even worse for you.
And it's interesting, we talked about, you mentioned it, Zach, is even the Taliban, generally native Afghans, to the south, they can't even run the country because they don't even have a grasp on the political and ethnic situation in these territories. So if the Taliban can't do it effectively, then what hope did the United States ever have of trying to create some sort of unifying government? That's an interesting point.
Yeah, it is, and I think we're going to get into this a little bit when we get to the final, the third stanza, if you will, of this episode. Is that they're probably better equipped now than they ever were back in the 90s to actually do that and effectively govern. But what you saw with this, and we've touched on the women's rights in Afghanistan with under the Taliban, whether it's directly, as you saw in the late 90s, or indirectly, where in villages where they rule or where they govern, is one of the first things the Taliban did, obviously, is they shut down all girls' education wherever they went. And then they slowly realized, well, not slowly, but they realized that most of the educators themselves were female outside of what we would consider Pashtunistan, right? That southern corridor from Nimrod, like southern Nimroz to the east up to Nangarhar, Paktia. Like, that's where the Pashtuns are. Outside of that, women teach. So now the Taliban, they went from shutting down girls' schools to having to shut down all schools because they didn't have anybody to teach. And that's when you see this decline in literacy, and you really see this economic opportunism in Afghanistan just plummet to the point where I think today the average Afghan makes something like $600 a year, which is less than what they made under the Taliban.
Yeah, and the Taliban, really, I think the only thing that they were able to pretty much do is destroy the poppy cultivation, which was at its absolute lowest just before the United States invasion. And then it ramped right back up again.
Surprise.
Yeah, surprise. And it's just, I mean, if the Taliban had no hope of governing the country, then what hope did the United States or anybody else? I mean, the Soviets before then, what hope did they have?
All right, so now we're in the timeline. We're at September 11th, and the attack on U.S. soil and the invasion of Afghanistan by the U.S. and its coalition partners. So essentially, the United States and the coalition swept in, and within a month, the Taliban government was essentially dismantled, and the Taliban were on the run because American air power was way too much for the group to handle, and you see a lot of talk about just the devastating effects of American air power on the Taliban in books and articles written since. So, what do you do when you've had control over a region and suddenly you've been ousted, but you're unwilling to surrender entirely because you'll probably, be killed? I mean, I'm sure Mullah Omar would be facing just a litany of human rights violations by the international community if he was ever to turn himself over willingly, and there's just no way out. And that was a feeling a lot of the higher level Taliban leadership in particular had, is that there's no way out but to continue operating outside of the international law. So, oh, good.
Oh, I was going to say, so like, I mean, the option then, Stu, is that you get you and your high-ranking Taliban buddies together, and you go to Quetta in Pakistan, and you hold the shura there, that basically sets up a shadow government as the United States come in, knocks you out. The lower level Taliban guys surrender, go back to their normal lives. The high level guys flee to Pakistan. They hold their shadow government meetings there, and they appoint people to kind of carry out these shadow government roles. Maybe not essentially at the beginning of the invasion, but certainly later on in the American occupation and Islamic government there.
Yeah, they are definitely a lot more. They're a lot better organized and prepared now than 2001. What you saw in 2001, like Kyle and Stu were saying, you had Omar fled to Pakistan after narrowly surviving a U.S. Aerial bombardment on his compound in Kandahar city. He flees to Pakistan. A lot of his senior commanders flee to Pakistan with him, and really from there, in time, they would set up that shadow governance system. But what you had is there were still calls from Mullah Omar to carry out the jihad in the name of the Taliban and the Islamic Emirate, and do it for the Pashtuns, and do it for Muhammad. But that wasn't the reality in Afghanistan, right? You saw a lot of these low level and mid level Taliban commanders like Mullah Cable, I think is a very good example. He even says it. Why would I follow this man who's in Pakistan? That he's not here trying to lead this fight. He fled. He understands why he fled, but he also understands that nobody's going to follow this guy because he's not here. That's how dedicated he was to it. The second he's faced with adversity, he leaves, right? So Mullah Cable, like many Taliban commanders, leaves the Taliban. He goes back to a regular life. He starts up a business fixing cell phones, even though he doesn't know how to fix cell phones. And over time, he learns how to fix cell phones. And what brought these guys back, what brought these former Taliban commanders back, and what has brought this new generation of fighter into the fray was that Afghan government that we propped up. We talked about in the last episode regarding corruption and how General Razik was, we got to get his name in every episode, right? How General Razik was an example of effective corruption. There's a lot of ineffective corruption in Afghanistan, and that's the problem. What you saw is Afghan police checkpoint commanders, Afghan army soldiers going around and using that authority, that monopoly of force that comes with working for the Afghan military or defense forces to force, they'd arrest people. They tell the family, you can have them for 1,000 Pakistani rupees and then we'll release them, and things like that. And you saw a lot of these former Taliban commanders who they just got tired of it, right? They're not going to sit here and they're not going to worry about, or they're not going to sit here and try to deal with this. And so they repatriate, or they go back to the Taliban, because you have to remember, during all this, we're fighting Al Qaeda, right?
Right.
Like we're not
Yeah.
fighting the Taliban. Al Qaeda was the enemy, and Al Qaeda didn't flee to Pakistan. Bin Laden did, but Al Qaeda stayed up in that Nangarhar area, right? Like for the most part, they're in the eastern part of the country, and they stuck
Nangarhar
around.
and Kunar, yeah.
Yeah, right. So this was a great opportunity for the Taliban to sit back and just kind of recalibrate and figure out where they were at what they did wrong. And when we look at the Taliban structure now, I think it's very safe to say that they have learned some of those lessons of where they failed in the past. And one of those we talked about in one of the episodes when there was that recent bombing that took out a Shia girls' school in Kabul. And I made the comment that I don't think the Taliban did it just because the girls are Shia. Uh, don't get me wrong, the Taliban are a Sunni extremist group. And when the day comes that we're out of Afghanistan and the civil war commences, they're not going to spare any of the Shia Hazaras. But what we have seen over the years, over these last 5 or 6 years, is that their focus has not been on the Shia population, right? They have publicly said, well, they're Muslims, right, and that's a starting point. So they haven't worried about that. They've been more focused on uh, correcting those deficiencies they had, especially out in the western parts of Afghanistan. But you see it in the south that works pretty well. You have a fully functioning shadow government, right? The Taliban provide courts, and there's a great CNN article that covers the Taliban court system in Helmand province, and it's very descriptive. It's very efficient. The locals view it as a very just system, and the big failure on the Afghan government in 2021 has been that failure to preside over judicial hearings and to safely and without in a non-corrupt manner protect the locals. And the Taliban have figured that out, and they've taken advantage of that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's so easy to get out of any, criminal accusations in Afghanistan if you have money. Like if you know who to pay and how much to pay them, then you're pretty much set to do whatever you want. I mean, Dostum is a shining example of that. He's been doing terrible things for years, and he's still able to keep out of trouble, despite not being allowed to go
Yeah,
to
from time to
Kabul
time.
for a little bit. But man, yeah, and yeah, yeah, but if you're some bumpkin, in the mountains of Aruzgan, and the local um, Afghan police commander is, awful, and he charges you every time you go through each one of his checkpoints. Like oh man, the corruption is so rampant. So their police checkpoints set up along routes all over Afghanistan, and oftentimes, instead of trying to stop and detain Taliban, they're simply there to tax people so that the local commander or the guys working the gate can get a little extra income. So if you're living in that situation as a dirt poor farmer, and the Taliban come in and say, "Hey, we're gonna make sure that those police either stay away from the checkpoints, or let specific people through, or uh, drive them away entirely, and we'll help you here, and we'll set up real justice for you, that you can, well, justice in terms of Sharia, which at the very least is like written down, and the rules are exact and easy for everyone to understand, because they've been raised in an Islamic system that educates you on the rules. Then that's a much better alternative in some areas to living trying to live with the Afghan government, where just like that low down Taliban fighter might have an issue with some guy in Quetta, Pakistan telling him what to do. Well, some guy over in Aruzgan might have an issue with some politician in
Right.
Kabul telling him what to do. It's like rural people in a lot of places in the world probably have a similar view to that. So you look at alternatives, and the Taliban have pretty easily in some areas been able to slip in and completely sidestep Afghan law and in place their own set of laws, which people go with.
And Afghans are a pragmatic people, so I mean, they'll accept whatever is the best system for them. I mean, obviously, it's easy to sit here and say, "Oh, it's terrible. The Taliban government's terrible." Like, yeah, maybe for us, but it's like, I mean, if your other option is being extorted every time you have to go down to the market, or, you know, living in fear of United States soldiers kicking your door down because your local commander turned your name into the U.S., like, I don't know. Is it really that much worse than that, if at all? So uh, you're going to do what's best for you and your family, and you're going to accept, whatever. But I do think, like Zach said, when the Civil War commences, because it will. I mean, it's been essentially been in
Mhm.
civil war for all these years anyway. I think the Taliban won't have a very hard time taking the South. They might have a hard time, especially in the power vacuum created by Razak's death. I I don't think the Taliban will have a hard time there, but they're going to have a hard time in the north. There's going to be some fierce fighting against them, I think, from the ethnicities up north and the Hazaras and
Yeah.
everything. But the south should be firmly under Taliban control fairly quick.
Well, I think the real benefit the Taliban have had from having to switch over to shadow governance and fight a guerrilla war is that the Taliban members in an area are ethnically and tribally of that area. So when they're recruiting people, instead of sending a huge group of people to sweep out and take over the country from the south and the east, and ending up with Pashtuns ruling over Tajik areas, you instead have like Pashtun pockets within different areas that are Taliban, and the locals know them both tribally and ethnically. And that's probably going to give them a way to worm in and seize a lot of especially rural areas.
And it's funny you bring that up. Just a great little fun fact, if we can call anything about Afghanistan a fun fact. Mullah Omar was not a Durrani Pashtun. He was a Gilzai Pashtun from the Hotak tribe, right? But the entire Taliban movement is almost exclusively Durrani Pashtun, right? You have your separate tribes like you're talking about. You go to Aruzgan, they'll be different than what you get in Helmand. But I always found that to be fascinating, and I do think that the Taliban are going to be in a better position. The civil war is going to happen, right? We're going to leave now. Fortunately, it looks like we're going to leave in July instead of September because uh, leaving on the 11th of September was a really stupid, uh, point of symbology that the administration was trying to do because that's just how, just you know, what's the word I'm looking for, like just unaware of what the reality of the situation is. They're going to give the Taliban another thing to commemorate, right?
Yeah.
So good job on them for somebody probably yelled enough that they're going to change that out, right?
Yeah,
But we're going to have that civil war is coming, and the Taliban are in a much better position now because they understand a little better those regional variances within the areas that they used to govern or they expect to govern.
I think that if I was the president or any high-ranking member of the Afghan government, the minute that U.S. troops leave, I would be on the C-130 with them, heading back to teach at Berkeley. That's all I'm saying.
He can write another book about fixing failed states.
Yeah, he can write another book, Fixing Failed States, from the safety of a professor's office in California.
Yeah, leave the CEO to handle things.
hey, it's like that scene in Futurama with Zach Brannigan. It's like, oh, how valiant of you, sir. He's like, no, Kip, how valiant of you going down with the ship. You've been promoted. Yeah, that's what he's gonna do to Abdullah. Yeah, like, you've always wanted this job, huh? See ya.
Yeah.
Right. But one of the I think something that's going to benefit the Taliban in this upcoming civil war version 4.
Yeah, I don't think
This
it
is
ever
version
stopped. Yeah, I don't think it's ever
okay
stopped.
version 1.4.
Yeah.
One of the things that's going to benefit the Taliban is something that we saw, and you'll see it in there's a great LA Times article that was released the other day about it. A lot of these new Taliban fighters are not these extremists, right? They're local villagers who know how to identify the winning side and they want to be a part of a winner, right? Those guys are providing security for my village and for my family, and they're keeping the Afghan police from extorting us. And you're seeing a lot more of that in southern Afghanistan. So I do think that's going to bode well for the Taliban because they're not going to have that this vision or this external view of hardline extremists, even though the current leader, Mullah Habatullah Akhundzada, I'd say is a true believer of the Mullah Omar ideology.
That is interesting you bring that up. Maybe a less hardline Taliban, just because, I mean, their recruits are coming from these young people that are used to in Afghanistan with pirated DVDs and, music and movies. That is interesting because I hadn't really considered that you might have a less hardline Taliban occupying than before. But I think that's almost kind of wishful thinking. But I mean,
And it probably is, right? I think and maybe it's trying to be not practical or pragmatic, but trying to be an optimist, right? Because I feel pretty strongly the Taliban is going to get that funding and that support from Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states after we leave, which will leave Iran to help with the Hazaras, right? And I'm sure we're going to indirectly fund the whatever the resistance is created out of the north, right? That's going to happen. We're going to be right back to 1996. And I think the Taliban will probably have the momentum, and maybe part of me just wants to think that they're going to be a little more humane when they take over the Harats and the Jowzjans and probably not Badakhshan, but those northern provinces when they get to Gore and they start running things. But I mean, time's going to tell.
it'll show, and it's happening. It's going to happen.
Good news for us is that we'll be paying some of the same people that we were back then too. So it keeps it a little simpler.
Dostum's getting the band back together, isn't he?
Pull out the Connexes.
Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Oh, Connex story. That's a terrible one. I do think that that we're in for I think a fairly quick Taliban seizure of the government.
I give it less than, I want to say less than a year to be less of a pessimist, but I give it 6 months and they'll run. I mean, they already run Helmand province, right? They'll run Kandahar. They've already got Kandahar city surrounded. I seen that the other day. They finally took Shawali Kot after trying their hardest. When I was there, they finally got it. They took control of the dam, which is the second largest dam in the country. That's good for everybody's water supply. Like, they're going to take Kandahar city probably by the end of this calendar year. They've already got Helmand. They'll take Uruzgan, and from there it's going to just spread like wildfire.
Yeah, Zach, let me sit here and type down all your predictions, because if we're right, I demand some sort of compensation from the government.
Which government?
Like, we'll tell you what's going to happen. Either one, I don't care. I'm willing to sell my services to whoever's paying them. Let's just get these predictions down. That's always fun.
They can pay us in cryptocurrency.
Yeah, send Bitcoin to my address. Our listener in Pakistan, I know what you're doing, dude. Go ahead. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Boardwalk Podcast. If you guys like this episode, please subscribe to us on iTunes or whatever fine app, wherever fine podcasts are listened to, I suppose. Make sure to click that subscribe button. We do appreciate your patronage, even though you don't give us money. And we'll be back next week. We'll have a special guest on next week to talk about, I'm sure, something interesting for you guys. And please be sure to follow our social media. We got an Instagram page set up. So a bunch of 30-year-old men setting up Instagram pages is something interesting. So follow us at the Boardwalk Podcast. And we post stories about Afghanistan there and information about upcoming topics. So thanks.